So people often like to talk about how blue seals are better than black seals, and that's something we'll talk about in a different video. But what if we were comparing a deck that's even older than blue seals to our black seal decks? Would it be even better? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So we have here actually a Bicycle Racer number 2 back from 1954. And yes, I did do all the calculations and it should be correct. And we also have here a Bicycle Rider back from our modern era. So we'll take a look at these two USPCC decks that are they're basically 70 years apart. And just as a couple of heads up, in case you're worried about me like comparing like a premium custom deck to like a normal rider back, you don't have to worry about that. The Racer number 2 back was basically our equivalent to the rider backs because they were just so common back then. They were basically used everywhere in like poker games and everywhere, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so these are just like normal like decks, okay, for everyday use. They're not like premium. And also, I don't have a deck that's from that era that's like sealed, unfortunately. So this may skew results a bit because it's already open and it is somewhat used, but generally it's still in good condition. So I wouldn't have to worry about that too much, but I still have to give a disclaimer just in case. So the first thing you'll notice about these older cards is that they are ridiculously thin. Like just take a look at the thickness difference. These are about like 7 cards thinner than your standard or your modern bicycle stock, which is really insane. And if we actually compare them to a crushed stock, these are still about 4 cards thinner. So these cards are ridiculously thin. Now remember, they didn't have crush stock back then. They didn't have the machines that like, you know, you adjusted the roller and then that created like crush stock and whatever, right? So why the paper or why the older stock is actually so thin is probably because of just the paper technology back then. Card stock was probably just like thin back then, right? And then as paper and printing technology just sort of advanced, they added more thickness to the card, so then they could withstand more like use, they could withstand more gameplay and more like different types of weather and humidity. So while the older type is older, is like way thinner. I don't know why I said older deck is older, that's obvious. So while the older deck is thinner, I don't think they would last as long simply because they're that thin. And again, this paper is not like built to like our modern standards, so probably less resilient to any sort of change. Another thing that you'll notice when you're holding these cards is that these cards actually feel kind of plasticky. The cards don't glide as well as they should, and when you drag your finger across the face of one of these cards, they actually just have this weird squeaky noise that you get from like paper, plastic playing cards. Visually, you'll actually see that the dimples on the cards are actually not as pronounced as our modern day decks. And you sort of have to see like the light reflect off of the card to sort of start seeing the finish, which is pretty interesting. So you have this very slight bit of texture as opposed to our modern decks where you can see a very pronounced like finish embossing debossing texture on the cards. So because of this less pronounced finish, the cards don't really fan and they spread as well as modern decks. You can actually see how even the modern deck fans, whereas with the old one, they just sort of clumps together in certain areas, leading to a very uneven fan. Maybe that's just me with my older used deck, or maybe I just didn't break in this deck enough, but you can see how forcefully I need to like spread this deck and then how uneven the fans are. So to compare the snappiness or the stiffness of the cards, let's just listen to the sound that the cards actually make through a flicker shot. We'll start with the older deck first. And then we'll move on to a rider back. So you notice that they both sound and they feel very similar, even though the older deck is like 7 cards thinner. Why? Who really knows? Maybe the paper making process back then was like less refined, which causes for less flexible paper, which causes for more snappy cardstock. Regardless of the answer, I was surprised when I first like tested it because I was like, oh yeah, this has to be flimsy, right? And I did the flicker shot and I was like, huh, that actually felt kind of better than our more modern decks. So I was just like, That's really weird, right? So you can expect the same amount of stiffness between these two decks, even though there's a considerable amount of thickness difference. So our last point of comparison is going to be quality control. So one thing you'll notice when going through the older deck is that some cards are off color. They aren't all the same shades of white. Some are more grayish than the rest, and some are more like, I don't know, yellowish too. So that probably relates back to our less refined paper making process, right? Not everything could be like this nice shade of white. Everything sort of has differences, right? There's blemishes and there's just all these weird things. You also notice some weird misshapes and some blemishes here and there with the ink. So the printing process again is also less refined, and you'll have like some weird results here and there. Whereas with our modern deck, you'll see these nice all filled in like solid shape colors, right? So there's a considerable amount of difference, but I don't even think that's like quality, like that's a quality issue. I think that's just like technological limitations from our older deck. But one thing I want to call attention to is look at the borders. The borders are shockingly equal. Like they are ridiculously like, they're like, the design is centered. I thought that, well, since modern USPCC decks would have like alignment issues, that older decks would too. But most of the cards, save for like one or two, are basically perfectly aligned. Whereas with modern decks, you have pretty consistent misalignments, which is pretty ridiculous. So while yes, the paper and the printing quality aren't like on par with our modern decks, the alignment is far better than our modern decks, which is sort of ridiculous to think about, that a deck from 70 years ago has better like alignment than our modern decks. It's just a weird thing to consider. It's fascinating to see how far paper printing and playing card technology has come in basically 70 years. I won't say that one is definitively better than the other, since how playing cards feel is very, very subjective. So some people prefer thinner cards, some people prefer like softer cards. There is no definitive answer. It's all just up to personal preference. But if there is one thing that I want you to take away from this video, it would be, well, one, man, USPCC quality control kind of sucks these days. I mean, they got outmatched from themselves from like 70 years ago, which is kind of ridiculous considering like their borders still kind of suck nowadays. Like, man, even their custom decks are kind of offset. But that's just that's just a joke. It's not really, but okay, that's whatever. But look at how far we've come, right? This is why preserving history is so important. It's so that we can look back on it and find ways to improve on it, or be proud of our current progress. And look at how far we've come, right? I mean, just comparing these decks like 70 years apart, right? The paper process got so much more refined. The printing quality also went up. And yeah, just overall, like, you can see just like all these small improvements that we wouldn't have noticed if we've just started with our bicycle rider backs. And you know, having a deck from 1954 really allows us to compare these two, and allows us to actually just, well, be happy with what we have and how far we've come. So, you know, I mean, as far as it goes, I mean, I'm not really a collector, so having a 1954 deck is like, it's whatever. But being able to see the progress, I think is really cool. But yeah, that's going to be it for me today. I don't know why I had a voice crack just then. Don't just ignore that. Yeah, stay healthy, stay safe, and see you guys next time.